At -20 F, she was thrown out of her home. So she broke into a forgotten railcar and built a place that saved lives. When 16-year-old Mara Keene climbed through the rusted side hatch of a derailed railcar at -20 F, everything stopped. The wind had been screaming across the rail yard seconds earlier, clawing at her coat, shoving needles of ice into every seam of fabric. But inside the car, the sound collapsed into a hollow stillness, thick, metallic, almost stunned. Her boots hit the floor harder than she expected, the echo bouncing once before dying. The door slammed shut behind her, not by force, but by gravity. The cold sealed it like a verdict. Her hands were blue to the knuckles, not numb yet past that. The skin had gone slick and waxy, the kind of color that doesn't belong to living things. Blood had frozen along her sleeve, where the jagged edge of the hatch tore her forearm open. The red wasn't red anymore. It was black, brittle, cracked like old paint. She sucked in a breath and immediately regretted it. The air burned. It scraped all the way down her throat, sharp enough to make her eyes water. Her lungs stuttered, refusing to settle into any rhythm that felt safe. Every exhale bloomed white in front of her face, then vanished too fast, like the space was eating it. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Crying wasted heat. Screaming wasted breath. She knew that much. Somewhere between panic and instinct, her body had already started choosing what it could afford to lose. Her legs buckled. She pressed her back against the steel wall and slid down until she hit the floor. The cold punching straight through her jeans like they weren't there at all. The metal leech warmed instantly, greedily, as if it had been waiting for her. She yanked her knees to her chest, arms wrapped tight, rocking once, then again not for comfort. But circulation. Her teeth started to chatter. Not lightly, violently. The sound echoed inside the rail car, too loud, too exposed. She clamped her jaw shut, forcing it still, her head pounding with the effort. Darkness pressed in from every direction. There was no light except what leaked in through cracks in the walls, thin, pale lines that barely deserved the name. The place smelled like rust and old oil and something sour beneath it. The ghost of cargo that had rotted years ago and never fully left. This car had been abandoned a long time. She hadn't. Not yet. Her fingers trembled as she pressed her palm against her thigh, checking feeling for sensation, for proof. The pain came late and dull, like it had to travel a long way to reach her. That scared her more than the blood. Her breath shortened. The edges of her vision shimmered. She tipped her head back against the wall, eyes unfocused, counting exhales because counting felt like control. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere outside, the wind howled again, rattling the car just enough to remind her how thin the barrier was between her and nothing. Her voice came out without planning, a whisper torn loose by fear rather than thought. "If I fall asleep," she said to the empty rail car, to the frozen air, to no one at all, "I'm not going to wake up." The words hung there. No answer came back, but something shifted anyway. Not warmth, not rescue, not safety. Just a line crossed a moment where hiding became something else, where surviving the night stopped being the only question, because in that rail car, in that cold, Mara wasn't just trying to stay alive. She was deciding without knowing it yet whether this place would break her, or become the first thing she ever built. This was a place where nothing was meant to live. The rail yard sat at the edge of town like something deliberately forgotten, cut loose from usefulness and left to rot. The tracks disappeared under layers of ice and packed snow, steel lines swallowed whole, leading nowhere. Boxcars leaned at crooked angles, their paint peeled into long, flaking scars. Tags bloomed across the metal in bright, desperate colors, names of people who'd come here to be seen and then vanished again. The air tasted wrong. Metal and old oil clung to the back of the throat, sharp and bitter, as if the ground itself was rusting from the inside out. Every breath carried it in. Every breath reminded you this place had once been loud, busy, alive, and now was none of those things. The wind never stopped. It screamed through broken freight doors and cracked seams, slipping through spaces no one had bothered to seal because no one had bothered to care. It howled low and constant, not like weather, but like something pacing, testing the walls for weakness. When it hit just right, the boxcars groaned slow, heavy sounds that traveled through the steel and into bone. At night, the rail yard went quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. No birds, no distant traffic, no human noise at all. Just the kind of silence that sharpened your hearing until every scrape and creak felt like a threat. The kind of quiet that made you aware of how exposed you were, how far help would have to travel if it came in all. There was no heat, Whatever warmth the sun managed to give during the day fled the moment it dipped below the horizon, sucked out of the metal until everything here matched the sky, hard, brittle, unforgiving. The cold didn't just sit on the surface. It burrowed, it crept, it settled into corners and waited. There was no power, no lights to soften the dark, no hum of electricity to suggest someone might notice if it went out. Once night fell, the rail yard became a study in shadows, long, distorted shapes cast by the moon, swallowing depth and distance until it was impossible to tell how far away anything really was. There were no rules, not the kind posted on signs or enforced by voices. Just one law, unchanging and absolute. The cold always won. It didn't negotiate. It didn't rush. It waited until you were tired enough to stop fighting it. Teenagers didn't belong here. There was nothing for them, no shelter, no safety, no future. This wasn't a place for mistakes or wandering or curiosity. This was where broken machinery went to be dismantled, where usefulness ended, especially not girls like Mara. Girls with scraped hands and borrowed coats. Girls who counted steps automatically and flinched at sudden sounds. Girls whose presence was already treated like a question mark everywhere else. And definitely not alone. Alone meant no one to keep watch while you slept. No one to notice if your breathing changed. No one to argue with the cold on your behalf. The rail yard didn't care how old you were. It didn't care why you were there. It didn't care what you hoped would happen next. It only knew how to strip things down to what they could endure. And as the wind rattled the walls of the derailed railcar, as frost crept across the inside metal in delicate, deadly patterns, the place made one thing brutally clear. If Mara was going to exist here, if she was going to make it through the night, she would have to do it against everything. This place was built to be. The first person to find her wasn't a rescuer. It was old Ben, the night switchman, who still walked the rail yard out of habit, long after the train stopped coming. No one paid him to do it anymore. He said the quiet helped him sleep. He said the tracks felt wrong if no one checked on them. Most people let him talk. Fewer asked why. His boots crunched across the frozen gravel as he made his usual loop, flashlight swinging in a lazy arc. The beam skimmed over rails, rusted couplings, a tangle of weeds lockstep with frost. He wasn't expecting anything. That was the point of routine. You walked it so surprises couldn't sneak up on you. The light passed the derailed car once. Then he stopped, turned, ran the beam back again. Slower this time, something moved. Ben's hand tightened on the flashlight. His shoulders went rigid. He took one careful step closer and angled the light through the broken hatch. A girl stared back at him, not standing, not hiding, curled into herself on the floor like she was trying to take up less space than the cold would notice. She was wrapped in torn insulation and flattened cardboard, layers stacked with a kind of desperate logic. Her hair was matted to one side, tipped with frost. Her lips had gone pale, almost the same color as her skin. For a second, Ben forgot how to breathe. Jesus, he said, the word coming out soft, more prayer than curse. He lowered the flashlight so it wouldn't blind her. Kid, who did this to you? Mara flinched anyway, just a twitch of her shoulder, a tightening around the eyes. She pulled the cardboard closer, instinctive, protective. She shrugged. Kids who've learned not to trust adults always do. It was a movement that said, don't make this worse. That said, I can handle it. That said, asking costs more than it gives. Slipped. She said, the word came out flat, rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in case someone found her, like it had already worked on other nights, in other places, with other questions. Ben didn't argue. He crouched instead, slow and careful, until they were almost eye level. He took his hat off, set it on the ground between them like an offering. The railcar creaked around them, metal contracting in the cold. Slip where? He asked gently. Her jaw tightened. She swallowed once, twice. Her eyes flicked to the open hatch, to the dark outside, to the wind carving lines through the snow. When she spoke again, the word didn't come out clean. He locked the door, she said. The sentence landed wrong, incomplete, heavy. Ben waited. My mom's boyfriend, Mara added. The rest spilling out faster now, like holding it back hurt more than saying it. We argued. He said I was done, said I wasn't his problem. Took my phone, threw it against the wall. I tried to get back in and he just turned the lights off. Her breath hitched. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth, hard, like she could force the sound back down. The house was dark, she whispered, like I'd never been there. Ben's throat worked. He looked away for a moment, toward the tracks, toward anything that would let him stay steady. And tonight, he asked quietly. Mara laughed once. It came out sharp and wrong. Tonight matters, she said. They said on the radio it's going to be -27 by morning. She shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at the frozen blood on her sleeve. I checked everywhere. This was the only place where the wind didn't cut straight through. She looked at him then. Really looked. I didn't come here to hide, she said. I came here because the cold wouldn't kill me faster. The words settled into the railcar, heavier than the frost, heavier than the silence, and for the first time since Ben had found her, Mara stopped pretending she wasn't scared. She didn't need to say anything else. The truth was already there. Shaking between them and brought her soup in a thermos the next night. He didn't announce himself, just tapped the side of the railcar twice soft, deliberate so she wouldn't startle. When the hatch cracked open, warm air spilled out in a thin, almost embarrassing thread. It smelled like chicken broth and pepper and something steadier than hunger. Mara stared at the thermos like it might disappear if she reached for it too fast. Careful, Ben said. It's hot. She nodded, hands shaking as she took it. The first sip made her eyes close on reflex, her shoulders sagging as heat spread through her chest. She hadn't realized how hard she'd been bracing until something finally loosened. Ben didn't stay long. He never stayed long. He set the thermos down, made sure her heater was clear of debris, and left the way he'd come quietly, like he was afraid attention would scare the moment off. The next night, there was a blanket folded just inside the hatch, thick, clean, not new, but cared for. Someone had taken the time to shake the ice out before leaving it. There was no note, no name. A woman from the salvage crew slipped her a flashlight the night after that. Small, heavy in the hand, the kind meant to last. She set it down without a word, gave Mara a look that was equal parts warning and promise, and walked away. It didn't go unnoticed. Men lingered longer by the break area. Conversations dropped when Ben walked by. Someone scoffed loud enough to be heard. We can't keep letting her stay, one man muttered, arms crossed tight against his chest. This turns into something. Into what? Someone else asked. Into responsibility. The word sat there, heavy and uninvited. There were practical arguments, liability, trespassing. What if she got hurt? What if someone asked questions no one wanted to answer? The rail yard wasn't a shelter. It wasn't meant to be used. Rules existed for reasons, but the reasons felt thinner every night the temperature dropped. Because this wasn't about a rule being bent anymore. It wasn't even about kindness. It was about what kind of adults they were willing to be when a kid had nowhere else to stand and nowhere safe to fall. About whether or not a problem still held when the alternative was a body found stiff in the snow. No one voted. No meeting was called. They just didn't chase her off. Instead, a stack of plywood appeared one morning, leaned carefully against the side of the car like it belonged there. Foam board followed, cut to size, edges taped so they wouldn't crumble. Someone left a box of screws and a handwritten note that read, "Anchor into the ribs." Not the wall. Ben watched from a distance as Mara worked. She didn't ask for help. She measured twice, cut once, braced everything with the kind of focus that comes from knowing mistakes cost more than time. She layered insulation where the wind cut hardest, sealed cracks with salvaged rubber, hung cardboard in overlapping sheets to trap heat like she'd seen once. In a hardware store window display. The propane heater was rigged carefully, too carefully for someone her age. Venting clear, clearance marked, a bucket of sand set beside it, just in case. When someone pointed out a flaw, she fixed it. When someone offered advice, she listened. And when the temperature dipped again that night, the inside of the railcar held. Barely. But it held. Mara sat back on her heels, breath fogging in the dim light, hands raw and shaking but smiling. Not the wide, grateful kind. The kind that said this works. She looked around the space, smaller now, tighter, warmer, and nodded once to herself. They had given her materials. She had given it meaning. And without ever saying it out loud, everyone involved understood the same thing. Whatever this was becoming, it was already too late to pretend it was nothing. Word spread quietly at first. A change in posture, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. Mara stopped flinching awake in class. She still kept her coat on, still sat near the door, but she didn't rest her head on the desk anymore. She finished assignments. She raised her hand once, only once, but it was enough to make her English teacher look twice. People notice improvement faster than they notice pain. The school social worker noticed. She followed Mara one afternoon at a distance, meant to look casual, and failed completely. past the last row of houses, past the plowed roads, into the rail yard where the snow lay untouched and the wind cut sharper. She stopped at the fence, stared, then climbed through. The railcar door was open. Warm air drifted out, not much, but enough to fog the cold. Inside, light glowed soft and amber, bouncing off insulated walls and handwritten signs taped neatly in rows. It wasn't just Mara. There were 3 other kids. One girl sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting canned food by expiration date. Another leaned against the wall doing homework under a clipped lamp. A boy no older than 13 adjusted his knit cap, the edges of his ears mottled with pale scars, where frostbite had once claimed its warning. No one panicked when the woman stepped inside. Mara looked up, assessed her face, then said, "You could stand by the heater, but not closer than the tape." There was tape on the floor, clear lines, clear rules. The railcar wasn't hiding anyone. It was holding them. By the time child services arrived, the story had already outrun them. They came prepared for neglect, for danger, for a situation that needed to be shut down fast and clean. What they found instead made them pause. Sleeping shifts posted on the wall, names rotated nightly so no one waits along without rest. Heat rules written in marker, smudged where gloves had brushed them. A supply list checked and rechecked. A calendar counting days, not hours. The kids answered questions calmly. They knew who was allergic to what. They knew where the fire extinguisher was. They knew the number to call if someone didn't wake up. Mara stood off to the side, arms crossed, not defensive, just braced, waiting for the part where adults took over and things broke. It didn't come. Instead, someone asked, "Who helped you do this?" Mara shrugged. People who didn't look away. The next morning, the rail yard wasn't quiet. Cars lined the street by the fence. Not police cruisers, not news vans, just regular vehicles, doors opening and closing in the cold. Teachers came with gloves and boots. Nurses came with first aid kits and quiet questions. Utility workers showed up with extension cords, power converters, tools they weren't technically allowed to use here. No one made speeches. They just unloaded trunks. Someone hung a banner on the fence, temporary, handwritten, crooked, "You are not invisible." From above, the scene looked impossible. A forgotten railcar, rusted, bent, abandoned, now ringed by people. Steam rising from cups of coffee passed hand to hand, breath clouding the air in shared rhythm. The contrast was stark. Cold iron at the center, warm bodies around it. A photographer snapped a picture before anyone thought to stop him. The headline came later, thrown out at -20°F. A team built a haven and a town showed up, was standing there in the snow, watching strangers pass supplies through a chain of gloved hands. Mara didn't know any of that yet. She only knew this. What had started as a place to survive the night had become a place no one wanted to abandon, and whatever came next, rules, systems, questions. This moment couldn't be taken back. The railcar wasn't forgotten anymore. Change didn't happen all at once. It didn't arrive with a ribbon cutting or a press release. There were no speeches declaring things better now. Mostly, there were mornings, cold ones, where someone showed up again. It happened in rides to school at dawn, headlights cutting through frost, engines idling while kids shuffled out of borrowed coats and into back seats. That smelled like coffee and old vinyl. No one asked too many questions. Names were learned slowly. Drop-offs became routine, away from the curb. A promise spoken or not that tomorrow would look similar enough to be trusted. It happened in quiet homework sessions under a bare bulb. The railcar hummed faintly now, power routed carefully, legally, after weeks of inspections and forms. The light was nothing special, harsh even, but it stayed on. Pencils scratched, pages turned. When someone got stuck, another kid leaned over, explaining softly, patient in a way they hadn't been with themselves before. Mistakes were allowed here. It happened when a volunteer stopped drinking because someone had to drive. No one announced it. He just started bringing juice instead of beer. His hands shook at first. Then they didn't. The kids noticed before anyone else did. They always did. The railcar gained windows, real ones, set into cutouts with frames sealed against the wind. Light poured in during the day, thin but persistent. At night, the glow leaked outward, a quiet signal that something inside was awake. Then permits. Clipboards appeared. Inspectors crawled under the car, checked wiring, nodded slowly. Paperwork stacked up. Rules multiplied. Some people grumbled. Some left. Enough stayed. Then a name. The Haven car, painted on a sign bolted to the side. Clean letters. Deliberate. The kids voted on it with a show of hands. arguing gently about capitalization. Mara watched it all from the center and the edges at once. She didn't become loud. She didn't tell her story on stages or correct people when they got it wrong. She didn't posture. She didn't claim credit. She became steady. The kind of steady that noticed when someone stopped eating, that moved an extra blanket closer without comment, that wrote schedules and erased them when they stopped working, the kind of steady that held when things went wrong, and they did. Kids came and left. Some returned home. Some didn't. One disappeared without warning. Mara didn't talk about that night for a long time, but she showed up the next morning anyway. She learned how to fill out forms, how to ask for help without begging, how to say no when yes would break something important. She learned the difference between saving someone and standing beside them. The railcar changed shape around her. It held laughter sometimes, music on low volume, arguments that ended without doors slamming. It smelled less like oil now and more like soup and clean laundry and something indefinable. But human. Winter eased. Spring crept in. Grass pushed through the gravel at the edges of the yard, stubborn and green. The kids started leaving the door open during the day. Birds landed on the roof. Confused but undeterred. People stopped calling it a miracle. They started calling it work. Mara preferred that, because work could be done again. Tomorrow. When someone asked her just once how she'd managed all of it, she thought for a moment before answering. I didn't, she said. I just stayed. The Haven car stood behind her, solid and imperfect, proof that staying was sometimes the bravest part. Time passed. Not cleanly, but it passed. 3 years later, Mara stood at a podium in a gymnasium filled with folding chairs and people who remembered the cold. The room smelled like floor polish and carnations. The bleachers creaked under shifting weight. Programs fluttered in nervous hands, corners already bent and softened by anticipation. A banner stretched across the far wall. Congratulations. Class of 2028, its letters bright, almost hopeful for everything that had come before. Mara adjusted the microphone once, then left it alone. She wore a graduation cap that never quite sat straight, the tassel brushing her cheek when she moved. The gown felt heavier than she'd expected, not with importance, but with memory. Her hands shook as she placed them on either side of the podium, the tremor familiar enough to make her swallow, just like that first night. She scanned the crowd. Ben sat in the third row, hat in his lap, eyes bright and unashamed. The woman from the salvage crew had cleaned up for the occasion, hair pinned back, hands folded tight like she was afraid of clapping too early. Near the aisle, the kids from the railcar sat together, not because anyone told them to, but because they always had. They looked different now. Healthier, taller, less guarded, alive in a way that didn't require constant calculation. Mara took a breath. When I was 16, she said, her voice steady despite the shaking in her hands, I learned something important. The gym went quiet, not the forced quiet of assemblies, but the kind that settles when people sense they're about to recognize themselves in someone else's words. Cold doesn't kill you first, she continued. Being invisible does. A murmur rippled through the room, then faded. Mara waited. She had learned the power of letting silence do its work. I spent a long time thinking survival meant not needing anyone, she said. That if I stayed small enough, quiet enough, the world couldn't take anything else from me. She smiled, just slightly. I was wrong. She glanced toward the back wall, where a framed photograph hung small, almost overlooked. A rusted railcar in winter, steam rising from coffee cups, people standing close enough to share warmth. Family isn't where you're born, Mara said. It's where someone refuses to let you disappear. Her voice caught then. Just for a second. She didn't hide it. It's the person who knocks twice instead of once. The one who leaves a blanket without asking for thanks. The one who shows up again the next morning. The railcar kids stood, not all at once. One, then another, then all of them awkward, emotional, unapologetic. Applause filled the gym, not sharp and celebratory, but deep and sustained, the kind that carried weight. Mara stepped back from the microphone. She didn't bow. She didn't cry. She just looked at them, every person who had made a different choice when it mattered. Dan nodded. No loose ends. The railcar had been decommissioned properly. The Haven car now existed as a permanent program, housed, funded, staffed. The kids had addresses, doctors, futures that no longer hinged on weather reports. Proof lived everywhere. In the way Ben stood a little straighter now. In the way the kids laughed without checking exits. In the way the word home no longer needed explanation. As the ceremony ended and chairs scraped back, Mara lifted her cap once, ran her fingers along the edge, and smiled. She hadn't just survived the cold. She had been seen, and she had made sure others would be too. Behind the podium sat a small, rusted object on display. Most people didn't notice it at first. Their eyes were still on the graduates, on the movement and color and relief of an ending earned. But the object waited patiently on a low table draped in plain cloth, unlit, unpolished, unchanged. The original railcar latch, bent where someone had forced it once, scratched where cold metal had bitten into bare hands. The rust wasn't decorative. It was layered, deep, the kind that only comes from years of being exposed and forgotten. A simple mechanism, never meant to carry meaning, only weight, still holding. After the applause faded and the gym began to empty, people drifted toward it without being told. They leaned in, read the small placard, stood longer than they meant to. Some reached out, then stopped themselves. Mara didn't. She crossed the floor slowly, graduation gown whispering against the polished wood. When she reached the table, she didn't smile for cameras or pose. She placed her fingers on the latch just briefly, just enough to feel its cold steadiness beneath her skin. It grounded her, the weight of it, the truth of it. This thing had kept the door closed when the wind tried to tear it open. It had held when the night wanted in. It hadn't been strong because it was special. It had been strong because someone depended on it. Mara lowered her hand and stepped away. Outside, the evening air was mild. Spring had taken over completely now. No frost clung to the edges of things. No one checked the temperature before breathing. Families gathered for photos. Laughter floated up and out, unafraid. But some moments don't belong to the season they're born in. They follow you. People left the gym carrying more than programs. They carried the image of a girl sitting on a metal floor, counting breaths, of a door that stayed shut just long enough, of a choice made quietly and repeated until it mattered. No one announced a lesson. None was needed. The latch remained behind, returned later to a small exhibit at the local library. Kids on school trips pressed their faces close to the glass. Adults paused mid-step, remembering things they hadn't thought about in years. What does it take to keep a door closed against the cold? What does it take to open one when someone knocks? The answer wasn't money. It wasn't policy. It wasn't even courage in the way people like to imagine it. It was presence. It was someone deciding not to walk past. Someone choosing to knock twice. Someone staying, long after the chairs were folded and the lights shut off. The words lingered, not spoken aloud, but felt, heavy and unavoidable. What would you do if a child had nowhere left to go? The latch didn't answer. It didn't need to, because the answer had already been given in soup carried through the cold, in blankets left without names, in people who showed up before they were sure they were allowed to. Be someone who shows up. And somewhere, in places not meant for living, doors held.